Well, I want to get us started, and I'm going to turn it to my colleague Robin to kick us off.
Hello, everybody. I'm Robin Flipsack. I'm a librarian at the Denver Public Library in the Reference Services Department. I'm joined today with my colleague Ross Mays. We want to thank you for attending our presentation today, Media Literacy in the Disinformation Age. This is part 2 of a 3-part series in partnership with PEN America. And we're privileged to have Nora Benavidez, the Director of U.S. Free Expression Programs for PEN, with us today. PEN America stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. Their defense of intellectual freedom is a natural fit with our mission at the Denver Public Library. And with that, I'll turn the program over to Nora to get us started.
Thank you so much, Robin. It's so great to be here with you guys. You know, I do a lot of these programs on my own, but I am so thrilled to be here with Ross and Robin and to be doing this training together with them. As Robin mentioned, this is going to be a 2-part training. And so I want to share my screen so that we can kick it off. If you'll give me just a second. Okay. Now, we're going to be together tonight as well as then next week. And I thought it would be useful for us to have a little bit of a roadmap to get us going so that you get a sense of what we'll be covering over the next couple of days. So everything's just loading. You know, in terms of part 1, we're going to, briefly review how the Denver Public Library, as well as PEN America, have been working sort of on the nexus in between disinformation and media literacy. I'm really honestly so honored to be here with these experts. They have been doing this so much longer than even I have. And so I learn a lot from them, and I'm eager to be listening when I'm not leading. We're then going to be reviewing what different types of misleading content look like. I think that it's really hard to understand how potent disinformation is and the threat of disinformation without really seeing what it looks like in practice and what examples are. And so our partners, Robin and Ross, are going to lead us through what the different types of misleading content look like. Then we're going to review what the history of disinformation is, and frankly, why we're so susceptible to it. When we know examples of it, why then are we as humans susceptible to falling prey to disinformation? And so much of that will set us up for our recap and then our review in day 2, next Tuesday, of our media literacy toolkit. Thinking through how do we actually empower ourselves and take control of our digital experiences so that we understand what we're seeing, how we can maybe be on the offensive and make sense of what is happening in our digital experiences, and hopefully prevent the spread of misleading and harmful content. So with that, I'm gonna just turn it back over. It's basically gonna be like a sports game going back and forth between Ross and Robin and myself. But I do think that it's really great to learn a little bit about what the Denver Public Library has been doing. They have been a model for me in thinking about why these issues matter so much for everyday people. And I think that librarians are, dare I say, some of the most powerful ambassadors of truth. So I'm so honored to have them here and to be leading this with me.
Thanks, Nora. So I just want to briefly in this slide go over the history of Denver Public Library's involvement in this kind of programming. In late 2016, shortly after the election in 2016, you started to hear terms like fake news, post-truth. Early 2017, you started hearing alternative facts, things like that. So we started realizing that this is something that, for one thing, is a big problem. And for another thing, librarians and libraries might be equipped to do something about, at least try to do something about, because reference librarians like me and Robin do have some training in evaluating information, spotting disinformation and misinformation and things like that. And we and libraries are in the business of doing public programs and talking to people about things and having people come in for presentations. So we put together a program called How to Spot Fake News. And the reason we called it that is that it was based on a flyer that was also being put out by other librarians who were thinking along the same lines. And this was the International Federation of Library Associations. So they put out this flyer, and I would encourage you to look it up. I don't have it here to show you, but it's very good. And there's a COVID-19 edition of it, which is also well worth looking at. But their flyer made the rounds, and we decided to base our presentation on that. And that in turn was based on an article by factcheck.org, which is one of the leading fact-checking organizations. Since 2016, we've constantly been changing our presentation to keep up with how the landscape of fake news has changed over the past 4 years, and it's changed enormously in many different ways. One of the big things that changed is the Russian disinformation efforts that really started to come to light in 2017. So we learned that the Internet Research Agency had a lot of what's called coordinated inauthentic behavior. And we're going to talk about that a little more later. Another thing that started happening is that the term fake news, we'll talk about what that originally meant and the kinds of things that originally referred to. And it evolved so that it sort of became weaponized by politicians to just mean whatever news I don't like, which is not what it should mean. And that's really, but because of that, now we tend to talk about disinformation and misinformation. We're going to explain those terms.
And I thought it might be useful sort of as the companion to this to speak a little bit about how PEN America got into this space, because I think it's a little less obvious. Librarians are the place you go from when you are a very small child through the rest of your life when you need to know something. And when you think about disinformation now, it seems so natural. But PEN America is, for those of you that don't know, is an organization that was founded right after World War I by writers who were all over the world concerned about the way words could be manipulated. And that when manipulated, people can be swayed, often for political and for personal reasons, when leaders, when authoritarians and other sort of figureheads weaponize words. And so baked into our charter, actually, at PEN America is the protection against mendacious publication. And I often think about that, and maybe it sounds corny, but I mention it because our charter was written in the 1940s, and yet we are in 2020 now in a vastly different political world. I mean, we now have the internet, and yet those words and the idea that we need to protect against the way words can be manipulated and weaponized is something that I think still resonates. It resonates for me, and it resonates for, as we have this community of people that care about what they see, I think it resonates for a lot of us. And so when PEN started researching this issue, it was as actually similar to Ross, we were calling this fake news. And we thought about this phenomenon of fake news and fraudulent news around 2016. And we released our first report in 2017, Faking News, which examined the effect of misleading content, fraudulent information and disinformation on the election. And then we did a sort of revisit of that in 2019, 1 year ago, to look at how the midterm 2018 election was swayed and affected by disinformation. And I have to say, it's so funny when I think a little bit about the differences in even our reporting between what we found in 2017 and then only 2 years later. because we've seen leaders use these terms. We've then seen these terms be co-opted by different organizations and people sort of across the political spectrum. But there were a few core findings over the years that we have come away with over and over again that really kind of undergirds a lot of our work in this space. One is that there is, when information is spread under the guise of news, it has a few really disturbing effects. And I think a lot of it feels intuitive. You know, one is that this results in people, a kind of deterioration of public trust. Our trust in the media, our trust in institutions. And when we are given different information or when we digest them differently, we may not even be able to agree with each other on shared knowledge of what's happening in this country. And when that happens, it feels almost like the more extreme ideologies, the more extreme theories, if you will, are given oxygen, especially in our digital space, and that they're very untethered from factual reality. And part of what we have wanted to do is figure out what are the ways that we can empower people, like all of you, to take control of what you're doing online. And so over and over again, we have come away with some of the solutions, and then what are the more misguided solutions that have unintended consequences. So to give you just a sense of what our findings have been over the years, I think it's useful to see that, one, we have seen over the years Russian and other foreign interference online in our elections, which absolutely continue to threaten the United States, but that there is something where Russians are playing a long game. What we have found is that so much of the content that they are promoting is not just to influence the American electoral process, but to stoke political polarization. And really that, I think, and what we have been promoting and working on for years, is that what that leads to is distrust in our democracy. We've also then seen this rise in domestic US disinformation and purveyors of fake and misleading information that are here in the United States. Sort of homegrown tactics is one of the ways that people talk about that. One of the other things that we've seen is that there is sort of on that fourth bullet point, misleading political advertisements. I have to say, I come back over and over again to how terrifying micro-targeting is. This is the type of content that each of us may be subjected to that is different from and uniquely tailored to each of us. And so what could have, let's say at one time on Facebook, passed as simply displeasing but still okay political rhetoric, now through political ads, each of us may be uniquely targeted with content that has been crafted for us, for our behaviors, for our likes, and small pockets of our communities are given different messaging, which means we're relying on that information to make decisions and our choices and our behaviors, who we might be supporting for different political office. So when we talk to each other, when I talk to Ross, if Ross is given a vastly different set of ads, that means that what he is thinking is truth for him could be incredibly different than what I am seeing and what I am basing my reality on, which is then potentially incredibly different from what Robin is seeing and the way that she is thinking about her choices, what she wants to talk about, how she's going to behave this election season. And so when we think about this in the lead up to the election, we now have, 90 something days. I think it's really interesting for us to consider why we do these. And part of why PEN America does all of this work is because we feel that you can't simply remove speech online. You know, I'm a First Amendment attorney. I will always promote the idea that we have to be protecting everyone's views, even if they are offensive. And one of the underlying sort of kernels of this is that so often the platforms can't simply remove disinformation. And so we think that one of the most promising solutions is media literacy, and that we have to empower citizens to understand what they see online. And so it's really with that principle in mind that we launched earlier this year. We're newbies compared to the Denver Public Library, but we launched our media literacy program called Knowing the News. And what we really wanted to do was give communities on the ground, now virtual of course, a sense of what can you do to make sense of what you see online? Because we are facing a deluge of content, right? I mean, just to give you a sense of this, look at what, according to our partners at Pew Research Center, they've been able to ascertain, is that over the years, increasingly, we all turn online. In the middle of the pandemic now, this general statistic is that people in the United States are online 55% more than they were before. That's a lot of time that we're spending in front of our laptops, in front of, or in our Twitter feeds and our social media feeds. And when we think about where we get news or how we're turning to access information, most of that now is through our social media feeds. You know, one of the findings just a year ago from Pew was that 52% of American adults used social media as the pathway to get news, and as the primary pathway. And as you can see, there are all of these other stats that so many Americans are going to social media as the gateway or pathway to access information. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues at the library who can kind of walk us through why some of that is so important when we're considering what our practices are. You're muted, Robin.
Thanks. Now is the time where we want you to actually do a little self-reflection. So take a look at this list, and we want you to start thinking about your own digital practices around how you get information, how you consume information. Do you look to print newspapers? Do you look to online blogs? Do you prefer getting your news from social media? How about the local TV networks or the national TV news programs, or maybe cable news networks? So thinking about where you get your information can actually help you to become a more savvy consumer. We're going to walk you through an array of media channels in a moment, and it's useful if you can start thinking about which of these channels you use to get your information, and perhaps maybe channels that have fooled you into believing and perhaps sharing some false information. So think of this as a first step in improving your media consumption practices. So let's, Nora shared the concept disinformation with you. I want to break this apart a little bit. So disinformation usually involves some sort of nefarious bad actor whose intention is to deceive you. And this can be an individual, but it can also be a more organized effort. And so, next slide, please.
Something had to go wrong.
It's going great.
There we go. Is
Okay.
my whole screen available, or is it?
It's not in present mode. It's your full screen. So we're talking about disinformation, but we want to bring in another concept here: disinformation and misinformation. Sound very, very much like synonyms, don't they? But they're a little bit different. We're defining them a little differently. So, and there's sort of a mnemonic device that we use. One, disinformation is dishonest. As our definition, it's meant to fool you. It's meant to deceive you. But misinformation is a mistake. So you, as a nice person, you fall for some sort of disinformation or misinformation, and you go out and you share this, never having the intention at all of harming anyone or fooling anyone. You might be trying to protect your friends. Oh, my friends need to know about this. I've got to share this. And you might have a lot of times some sort of emotional response that gets you to share something without thinking. So we want you to think of those concepts a little differently. And now we're going to walk you through each of these different kinds of misleading and oftentimes demonstrably false information sources. So the first one is the imposter website, or the fake news website. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So here is an example of a totally fake news website. Bill Murray being a big hero in Phoenix and stopping a bank robbery. Except, as a high school student once said to me, you know, I don't think there's an ocean in Phoenix. And by golly, she was right. This is not a true news story. If you look, it looks like it's something from ABC News, but if you look to the right, and you look up at the top, and there is a web address or a URL, and it's abcnews.com.co. That is a site. In this case, it was an individual who bought that web domain, and he just was trying to be an imposter site to ABC News to fool people into thinking they were looking at an ABC News website. So, haha, that's kind of funny. There's, Bill Murray in character, and maybe you're laughing at it, but there are more nefarious examples of this. And so in our next slide, you'll see that the same website, abcnews.com.co, this internet troll, he created a fake Craigslist post where he put out a want ad looking for actors to protest at a Trump rally, paying you $3,500. Then he went to his fake news site and he created an article that linked back to that Craigslist post to give it some veracity, supposedly. So first of all, your hackles should go up when you say $3,500. That's too good to be true, because how many of us have made, if you've made $3,500 in a day, you're blessed, but it doesn't happen for most of us. So there should be something in here that kind of gets you thinking, oh, this doesn't pass the smell test. But remember, I mentioned those emotional responses you might have to misinformation and disinformation. And in this case, on the right, here is a tweet from Eric Trump, who he fell for some disinformation and he shared misinformation. He thought, wow, look at this article. This vindicates my dad. I'm going to share this article on Twitter. Kind of, using that emotional response to act instead of taking a step back and thinking, is this credible? So he shared this fake news article on his Twitter account. Okay, so next type of misinformation, disinformation, clickbait and spam. If you have searched the internet, you've seen occurrences of clickbait. Sometimes they're at the bottom of even credible news sites. Sometimes they're on the right-hand side, or they're embedded in an article. You'll be reading along and then all of a sudden there's some funky links in there. I like to point out Barbie Benton because I was a young person in the 70s when Barbie was at her height, and I think, boy, I really am kind of curious about what Barbie Benton looks like right now. That resonates with me. So I have this emotional response to I'm curious, right? Clickbait is meant to generate some curiosity in you. What happens next? I want to find out, and it gets that emotional response going in you to click on that article. And it really isn't so much an article as it is a revenue stream for somebody. So when you go down this click path, they're going to make you click, 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 click through this article about Barbie Benton, all the time sort of being bombarded with advertising. I like to say every time you click on some clickbait, an angel gets a penny, because every one of those clicks monetizes clickbait for somebody. So you're not really looking at super credible news. It's really someone who's figured out how to ping that emotional response in you and make some money off of it. Then let's talk about misleading social media posts and memes. So a meme is something that gets shared over and over again. And just like a social media post, it can go viral, right? Doesn't mean that all posts that are shared are misinformation. Doesn't mean all memes are nefarious. But this is a local example in Thornton, Colorado. So from a site called Nextdoor. If you're not familiar with Nextdoor, it's a way to locate you geographically with your neighbors. So in my neighborhood, I could be hooked up with all of the people around me, and we can share messages on this online message board. Like, I have a rototiller I want to sell to you. Come over to my house and give me $25. Or I'm worried about crime in this neighborhood, or clean up your garbage cans, folks. It's a way for us to communicate. But these social media sites like Nextdoor, like Facebook and Instagram, you can share information that's not credible. So in this case, average Thornton resident went onto Nextdoor and said, your water is not safe right now in the time of COVID. You could potentially be infected through your water source. And so some folks shared screenshots of this with the municipality, and they had to get their communications director for the city onto Nextdoor, giving out credible information like, stop sharing this, your water source is safe, you know. So this idea of memes, it's not that memes in and of themselves are evil or bad, but it's this sharing that can happen when the information is not credible around them, which can be problematic. And now, Ross, take it away.
Okay, so the next kind of thing we're going to talk about is these are examples on this page of some of the things that were created by the Internet Research Agency, the Russian organization that's closely connected with the Russian government. And not only the Russian government can engage in this kind of activity, other foreign governments have done this, and the same kind of behavior can be engaged in domestically. Different political parties and politicians and organizations in the United States can do exactly the same kind of thing. But this is an example. I want to show you how powerful this can be. What we see here is over on the left here are memes and really they're ads for the most part that appeared on Facebook probably during 2016. And so they're pro-American Muslim organizations, or that's what they appear to be, but that's not really what they are. These were created, there is no United Muslims of America organization. This was all created in St. Petersburg by someone at the Internet Research Agency who is being paid to produce basically propaganda, or what's also called coordinated and authentic behavior. The same people also created an organization, a fake organization called Heart of Texas that you see in the lower right here. This was pretended to be a very conservative organization. They were advocating secession for Texas, things like that. And they were also very anti-Sharia law. They were saying, you know, it was like there's a danger of Sharia law taking over the United States. So these things created by the Internet Research Agency started calling for people to come out and go to a protest at a mosque in, I believe, Houston. And people did. People in the United States got up out of their chairs, went down to this mosque and gathered there. And as you can see, there are people on both sides, and some pretty shady things happened. As we can see, some white supremacists showed up here. So things got heated enough at this protest that fistfights nearly broke out, things like that. So just by sitting at computers in a little cubicle farm in St. Petersburg, the Russian government was able to start Americans doing this kind of thing just through propaganda and disinformation. So they have various ways. I'm not going to go into the various ways they do that. It includes things like fake profiles, bots, which are computer programs that can artificially amplify messages, and trolls, which are humans that, in this case, these are paid professional trolls that are paid to just sow division online, basically. So this is a kind of extremely powerful disinformation that's going on right now. And on the next slide, so here's another example, and this shows in terms of things like fake accounts, this sort of behavior, this can happen locally or at the state level. So here we see 9 News did a story on this. On Facebook, an organization appeared on Facebook called Colorado Law Enforcement, and it had these logos that made them look like they were a Colorado government organization. So, and then if you read their little blurb, it says they're an organization of Colorado law enforcement officers and some retired officers, things like that. There is no Colorado law enforcement organization. There's no organization in the Colorado government called that. And so they were posting things like this. They were posting a fake meme from, what was purported to be left-wing activists, you know, militant left-wing activists that were saying, tonight's the night, comrades. They actually use the term comrades. And we will move into the residential areas, the white hoods, and take what's ours. Now, this is also not real. It was just created. Real people that are really in this movement probably don't really say comrades, for example. And Colorado law enforcement is also not real. So this can happen locally too. On the next slide, and another thing, this is a very different kind of misinformation because it's not really fake exactly. What it mostly is misleading and very divisive. This is just highly partisan or highly biased sites. And these tend to, they can be truly false or dishonest, but what they mostly are is just extremely inflammatory and extremely biased. So I really have these switched in the wrong places, but here on the left-hand side of the page is a far right-wing hyperpartisan site called Gateway Pundit. And you'll see here, they say things like creepy Uncle Joe. You know, here's an extremely unflattering picture of Hillary Clinton. You'll see that a lot. That is, you can almost tell what side of the spectrum a news site is on by whether they use a flattering picture or not of a politician. So this kind of language here, this is not an objective, authoritative source, obviously, when you see a thing like this. Over here with addicting info, this was extremely popular on Facebook right around 2016 elections. And as you can see here, campaign's old tweet comes back to bite Donald, and they have to asterisk out the swear words, and they have they actually put on the caps lock, things like that. So this is not credible information. It's usually very low quality articles, often kind of lifted from other organizations. And then on the next slide, we see, this is more fun, satire. So everybody's familiar with satire. You're probably familiar with websites like The Onion. The Babylon Bee is one that's become pretty popular recently. So here we have Colorado Parks and Wildlife engaging in satire. So they're saying it's 2019, it's jackalope season. Well, hopefully every Coloradan knows that there's no such thing as a jackalope, really, if only there were. But as you can see here, application deadline is April 1st. So that gives you a clue. If if somebody didn't realize that the jackalopes don't exist, they could look at this and say, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. So this is the kind of thing that can happen. Now, this is all in good fun, but what I like to say in our presentations is that these days, every day is April Fool's Day. And it's not always in good fun, because a lot of satire sites, sometimes they can get shared by people who are well-meaning, but it can cause a stir because people believe it. And then also there are some sites that kind of claim to be satire as a way of hiding the fact that they're really just internet trolls. And they'll post things that are really meant to fool people, but they'll call themselves satire sites. So satire can be a label that covers a spectrum from fun to really kind of malevolent. Okay, and next slide. Okay, and so over here we see, I think most people are aware these days that one of the most common forms of misinformation online is misleading photos. One way that photos can be misleading is if they're just taken out of context or presented with a misleading caption. And this can be done completely innocently, just start innocently. So on the left, you may have heard this right after the COVID outbreak really intensified, people started sheltering in place, and memes like this started going around. This one shows swans in Venice, and the tagline was often like, nature is healing, it's the earth is healing. Well, there's nothing fake about this photo. It's a real photo, But the fact is, swans have been in this canal in Venice for decades. There's nothing unusual about that. So this is not happening because people are sheltering in place inside. Now over here on the right, we see an example that's, for one thing, local, and for another thing, much more nefarious. This is true disinformation over here because somebody meant to do this. Here we see, this is in front of the Colorado Capitol. As you can see, you may recognize the statue. Here's someone waving a sign that says, "Save my right to die." Over here is someone that says, "Defund science." Now that's just on the edge of believability, but the fact is that this didn't happen. These are both photoshopped. And then down here, this actually appeared in Snopes, is the original picture here. So fear is the real virus. The cure is worse than the disease. Now you may disagree or not disagree with the signs, but the fact is these are the real signs on the bottom, and the top ones never appeared. Somebody tried to Photoshop these to make the protesters look bad. And then next slide, we're back to Nora.
Thanks, Ross. Ross and I and Robin, before this session, I hope you don't mind that I admit it, Ross, I have to call you out because Ross and I both love the Venice Canal Swans photo. And even when we were going through some of the things we sometimes fall prey to, I always admit to people when I do these workshops that when I saw the Venice Canal photo, I loved it. I absolutely believed it. There were other examples that we will get into and that we've been talking about that even Ross said he fell prey to. So you just honestly, I think I mention it mostly because media literacy, you know, and sort of the toolkit that we'll go through next week, I think is a really long process. And part of what can be almost alienating is the idea that you have to suddenly become an expert today at the end of this training. I mean, I hope, of course, that you will slowly take in all of these little kernels and nuggets of knowledge and tips, but it's a long process. So I kind of love being on the receiving end, hearing all of this, because even I will sometimes not be on my sort of defensive, thinking critically about what I see. But I want to give you guys some examples of other ways that accounts can actually be fake and misleading. And there are a few different ways that can happen. On the left, you'll see this Twitter account from Rashida Tlaib, supposedly. Rashida Tlaib is a member of Congress, and the content of this tweet is incredibly incendiary. Depending on what you feel when you read it, it could be anything from anger, offense, shock, who knows what it could be, any range of things. And what we always try to bring out here is just be really careful of the accounts that you are looking at. Because if you are careful, this is an example where the L in her last name is not an L here. It is a capital I. And she doesn't have that blue check mark verification that Twitter provides for different public figures. Now, generally, you know, way back in the day when Twitter introduced that, one of the sort of early inspirations for the blue check mark was the idea that we need to give online users a sense of trust, who to trust, what voices are trusted partners and voices when you go online. And so the blue check mark is one of the ways that at least it verifies who this person is. That can change sometimes, right? Because various politicians now will have their professional accounts and they'll sometimes have a personal account. And not everything always has a blue check mark. So there is sort of a caveat that you always want to be careful. But at the same time, you want to think about if there is some kind of content, a tweet, a post, an email that seems shocking, that really pulls at your emotions, kind of like Robin mentioned, think about, can I verify this account? Because when you actually go in to verify this actual account, the Rashida Tlaib, it is not the real Rashida Tlaib. And so in the same breath, you want to think about when you get other types of contact from people. On the right is a screenshot of a real tweet from my colleague who I know is an organizer and an attorney in Atlanta. She was organizing a lot of the responses around the recent George Floyd protests and came across people contacting her saying, hey, I'm getting these emails from blm@gmail.com. It's telling me to go somewhere, to a random protest site. And what ended up happening was that these, literally 2 months ago, these organizers investigated what the email account was. They confirmed that no other organizers in the area were organizing something to that site. And they said, well, that email account is not verified. That's not something that's a real credible source to get information about the protests. And essentially what she was tweeting out was trying to inform followers to be careful. And so there are a couple of things here to point out. One is you should always be critical if you get an email from an unknown site about anything. As election season ramps up, people may be asking for money. There are a range of ways that bad actors may try to reach out. And you always want to be able to think critically about what you're seeing. Sometimes even the accounts listed in the email may not match what the email itself is. So if there were a way for blm@gmail.com to be introduced in your inbox as Nora Benavides, that might be another signal where you want to hover over the actual email address to find out who's sending you something. The other thing that my colleague here did, which I thought was really interesting, is not only did she call out that there was this problematic email address that was sending things, but she tried to then correct course by giving people a place to go for actual credible information. And so she included a lot of information here about be careful that you're not lured out into unsafe environments. And if you really want to get more information, go to this other credible site. And so generally, if we're thinking about all the ways that people or bots are contacting us, we want to be incredibly thoughtful and careful about, can I verify who's reaching out to me? Can I verify things on Twitter that might seem really shocking? Because very often it might not be a real account. It could be a bot, which is, as Ross said, a computer automated type of account. So just always be incredibly careful. I want to shift gears a little bit. You know, we have a little bit of time left, and I'm sort of sensitive to time, but I think it's important, as Ross and Robin, I think, did an amazing job outlining all of the ways that content can be problematic, misleading, the ways disinformation permeate our news feeds. It's important, I think, to know a couple more things, which is that there is this long history of disinformation. And why are we so susceptible to it? What is it about our human nature that happens where we fall prey? And so I want to start by just sort of, intention and tone setting, that disinformation has been around for a very long time. And I'm not going to go through a history lesson. That never does well when we do history lessons in these trainings. No one liked history. I did, but I understand. Maybe Robin and Ross did as well. But, you know, just sort of be aware that there is this long history in which words, to use this sort of PEN America framework, have been used to make people believe something, to manipulate them. One of the easiest examples is political propaganda, or the way that even in early American publications, politicians would sling accusations at each other in those publications. And they were sometimes wild statements, which when you think about now where we are, it actually doesn't feel so different. But that long history, you know, you can see from medieval Europe, in early America, as I mentioned. There was then this period in the late 19th century called yellow journalism, fascinating era. And then during the Cold War, the actual term for disinformation, many believe is a Russian term, which I will not even try to pronounce because I usually get it wrong. But it's great to know that there is this sort of long history there. So the question becomes, and this is one of the questions I get asked the most often, I would say, is how does disinformation work? So I want to break down a few elements of it. And, you know, the content being delivered to you is sort of the vehicle of it, but how internally is it working for us? Robin mentioned emotions already, and I'm so glad that you did, Robin, because I really think that disinformation thrives on engagement. It thrives on that feeling. Think about when you read something, or you see an image, or a video. And what's your reaction? It's, oh my gosh, you can't believe it. Or it could be furious. You could be so angry about some kind of headline. You could also maybe see, let's take it to the present moment, because this is a real situation that has happened. You could potentially be on Twitter and see a video as you're scrolling of people throwing Molotov cocktails into police cars. And the caption could be something like, "This is happening down the street." And what do you think to yourself? Oh my gosh, is this happening? You know, you're shocked, you might be scared, you could be angry, maybe you're inspired, you want to get out there. There are kind of a range of things, but emotion is one of the most fundamental ways that disinformation thrives. Because when we play into it, we're trying to explore more. We engage with it, we'll like things, we'll comment, we'll share. And part of what we try to do in these trainings is help break down that passive reaction so that you're not just saying, I'm shocked, I got to share this immediately. And so what then happens? I think that part of what happens is that there is, in leading us to believe what we see, there is this patina of credibility that disinformation has. And I'll give you an example when we talk about sort of the flow chart of how disinformation will get created and produced. But really there is often this, what I call kernel of truth, that something feels real. You know, if you see a video like that, maybe it isn't completely disinformation, but it's a caption that has been misattributing whatever is happening in the video. And so there's that feeling often when you see an article, an image of like, that seems kind of real in a weird way. And you don't quite know what it is, but you're already piqued with your interest because of emotion, and there seems to be something real about it. And then bots. Bots are interesting, and we've talked a little bit about them. Part of what I find terrifying about bots is that they can help proliferate content very quickly. So if only Robin, Ross, and I are in charge of the internet, let's just pretend we are in this fantastic, fun world, right? And we are pushing content out. We're only pushing so much. And let's say then it gets into all of your hands. Well, there are only so many of you, dozens and dozens and dozens of you here tonight, but there's only so much for content to proliferate if only I'm posting it and then Robin posts it. It can only go so far. But part of what's so magical and horrifying about bot activity, and especially Ross mentioned at the beginning, there's something called coordinated, inauthentic behavior, is the ability for these automated accounts to share content at record speeds. And so it will be pushed out on feeds, your feed, my feed. Others then will seem like they've liked or engaged with something, and it adds to the emotional aspects of your reaction. Because you may see something that has been shared, 3,000 times. And when you do, what happens? You want to know. You want to get in on the action. And so you say to yourself, oh my gosh, it's important, it's controversial, it's playing on my heartstrings, and it's really getting a lot of engagement. One of the most powerful things that bots provide is that sense of something being salacious and cutting edge, breaking news, that you are engaging in something that everyone else is already in on. And so part of what I try to help people do when we talk about bots is think about platforms really can't get in front of the problem ever if all we're doing is thinking about, the content moderation piece of Facebook, that maybe Facebook should be removing things. And so instead it's why, not to sound corny, but we always come back to people, that each one of you has to take control of what you're doing online, because it's really impossible to get in front of the kind of activity that bots are able to create and then proliferate. And then the final two pieces of disinformation are really that psychological element. The illusory truth effect is basically a brain shortcut. It is our brains that tend to believe something the more times we see it. Facebook in 2016 did a preliminary experiment on this. And what they did was they brought some people together to look at headlines. Some of the headlines were true and some were false. And during the course of their speaking with these people reading headlines, they would say, oh yeah, that one's false, or that one's true. And then people were shown more, more headlines and more content. But in the second phase of being shown content, part of what these people were shown were the headlines from the first round. And irrespective of whether the content the first time had been true or false, when they saw it a second time, they were more likely to think it was true. And so Facebook said the more often a lie is repeated, the more it seems true. That even when we try to debunk for ourselves what we're seeing, we kind of just double down on it, because psychologically there's that trick where you see something and you're like, oh yeah, I've seen that before, that's true. And so what it means is that in terms of how platforms think about fixing or trying to fix these problems, it's incredibly hard. It's the barrier there of thinking about how do we break down people's natural illusory truth effect, and then how do we break down our confirmation bias? Because so often when we see something that we believe that echoes or reminds us of our own sentiments, we also tend to then like it, we seek it out, and we tend to believe that more because it helps confirm our own implicit bias. So here's just a little bit, as I was speaking, of what the illusory truth effect is. And as these experiment researchers said, every time a lie is repeated, it appears slightly more plausible. It's kind of scary when you think about how we break that down. So I want to walk you through one more thing, which is really what the phases of disinformation are. And I know we're kind of winding down here, but in thinking about what does all of that process look like, all the elements, let's take a case study. It helps to apply, right? So I want to take a story that was the most engaged post during the 2016 election. And that was an article written by what is now considered maybe an unknown source, but probably a news hoax website. It's really considered this WTOE5 News. A story that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump for president. What's interesting is that this story started with a kernel of truth. It started with a real interview that the Pope did about the probability or improbability of the government reaching Hillary Clinton's emails. And that interview was then spliced together because really he was being interviewed about both of the presidential candidates, the Democratic and the Republican. And what happened was whoever the unidentified person was who actually created the article itself took that interview, cut and pasted together, and made it seem like the article headline was, "The Pope endorses Donald Trump for president." And then what happens? After it gets created, it gets produced. So WTOE5 News published the article on their site. And then what they did is it was shared over and over and over again. But first, it was shared by someone on Facebook working for this coordinated network of fake news sites. And then this is the part that I always think is the most powerful, is what happens is someone who is connected with these bad actors and maligned campaigns, right? They post it, and then Robin sees it. And Robin is an engaged citizen. She's eager to vote this election season. She is excited to share information about the Pope because she has a news alert set up for it, don't you, Robin? And what happens? She has no ill intent. She's not trying to deceive anyone. She sees this article and she says, wow, this has gotten 1 million engagements on Facebook. I have to get in on the action. So she shares it. And when it has been reproduced by others, that is when then imagine the tentacles of Ross doing it and me doing it and all of you doing it. And it's kind of why I come back to this important point that all of us can be publishers in a way. That moment that Robin, right, is about to share and she says, I love this article, everyone needs to know about it, whatever the reason is. Or Ross, if he says, I'm furious about it, whatever his reaction, if he's feeling something emotional, it feels like maybe that article has what? A kernel of truth, some kind of patina of credibility, and bots have been proliferating it online so that it's engaged with literally as the most engaged post during the election season. And so what happens is it plays into all the elements of how disinformation works. And eventually what started as disinformation becomes misinformation. Because when Robin and me and Ross share it, it is no longer us manipulating or wanting to manipulate people. It's us just sharing out of mistake. And so when we think about that, especially as we're kind of winding down today, I think about teeing up for all of you the ways that we're going to walk you through in the next session, how to not fall prey to this, how to apply media literacy tools and skills so that all of the types of content that Ross walked you through and that Robin walked you through, you're ready to identify. And again, I want you to not be scared, right? Not feel like you have to be an expert immediately, but that you're going to dip your toe in and you're going to start with a few things. So for now, I want to sort of wrap up. I think that we're open to questions because I know we're tight on time, but Robin and Ross, are you able to stick around for a little while if we do have questions? Okay, great. I'm going to direct everyone here that the Q&A box is the best place to ask questions. I will, just a roadmap of our series, and I am going to pull up the questions here and stop sharing. I think everyone who is a panelist can read, but I'm going to read aloud for everyone who is an attendee. We have one question in the Q&A, which is locally, oof, I'm off the hook. There we go. Robin and Ross, it's all you. I'm joking. Locally, we had issues with our police using accounts to monitor activists. We have more recently dealt with local politicians supporting moderate provocateurs and condemning more progressive activists and organizers by doubling down on the reports and broadcasts afterward. How do we as librarians respond to such disinformation? What is a good way to redirect if not many conflicting sources exist? I'm happy to answer some of this, but because it's local to Colorado, I want to defer to my partners who actually are in Colorado.
This is a really complicated one. I think, you know, the best that we can do, one thing that we can do as librarians, especially if we're in the room with somebody, is we can, if they're looking at sources and trying to decide what to believe, we can go through things with them at the time and just show the things that we use and the techniques we use to try to verify information and try to decide whether it's true or not. I don't think we can really say, this is true because I said so. We have to say, here are the reasons that I think this is trustworthy or not. Robin, what are your thoughts on this one? This is a very involved one.
Yeah, and I think two thoughts that I have seem more long game, long term. One, are you supporting your local media outlets to the extent that you're able to? A lot of us, you know, are used to getting our news online and for free now, and sometimes we forget about the benefit of supporting a robust local reporting ecosystem. If you were with us last week, we had a panel of Denver journalists, and they really wanted to emphasize how open they are to your suggestions of what should be covered in the news. So, you know, maybe it's you getting in touch with media outlets and asking them to bring stories that are important to you to the fore. Nora?
I would, of course, echo and sort of agree with both Robin and Ross. And I think it's a really hard question. Not punting at all, but I'm saying I think it's hard because there are within this sort of implications around politics. And unfortunately, what I think we deal with a lot in the misinformation, you know, media literacy space is that facts have, through leaders, become politicized. And the hardest thing is to now talk with people in ways where we can agree on things, right? Where I could potentially say to Ross, well, that's not true. And Ross can then agree. That's really hard actually now. Like, that's part of why we are doing these sessions. It's part of why I'm so deeply worried about our election. That just the sense of shared information and knowledge that we all, I think, used to operate more sharing is really kind of eroding. And so when we think about what librarians can do in these really nuanced spaces where leaders are weighing in, where then media seems to weigh in only to a certain extent, I think a lot of it has to be that you all, because I'm not a librarian, right? But I think you have to be able to give people tools. where you're able to say, here are the questions we ask. Here are the ways that we think about assessing the credibility of our sources. If there aren't that many sources out there, that's its own issue. And frankly, a piece that's sort of adjacent to our work here is that actually we deeply believe at PEN America that we must support local news and journalism, because it is one of the lifelines to helping people engage and trust what they see. So when there is very little out there for communities to actually turn to, that's part of when, like, the moment is when they turn to disinformation. And so we just want to be in a point, and I think that we all want, whether it's librarians or other stakeholders, to begin asking the right questions. Can I verify what I'm seeing? Can I look up what news outlet is posting this? What are the underlying biases of the politicians who are saying what they are? What are the underlying political beliefs of other people involved here? A lot of that will only reach a point where people then have to make their own decisions. And so because I think through that next session, we're going to be talking a lot about actual tips, I really, urge you to come back. And I think that it's a great way to imagine why media literacy is so powerful. Because I have to say, when I started the program, the idea of talking about information didn't sound very exciting. I mean, I loved it, but I was like, how do I make that sound fun? Because the idea of parsing through information can sound really boring. I am the most aware of anyone, probably Robin and Ross as well. Like, how do you make something enticing? And so this is a long process, and asking questions is part of what I think librarians can help do. I want to ask one other question that has been in the chat, which is, Checkology is now freely available. Is anyone considering using this tool as part of their news literacy education program? I think Checkology is a tool that is created by the News Literacy Project. And I'll just say that they are an organization that I've worked with before. I'm not sure if Robin and Ross have. They mostly work on creating curriculum for educators for middle and high schools, so that educators can be trained kind of like this, but on specifically news literacy and how to educate their students. So just for those that might not be aware in the conversation attending now in the audience.
Yeah, I just shared a link to what is Checkology in the chat. I just got the email an hour before we got on this webinar that they were going to start offering their product for free right now. So yeah, the News Literacy Project has done a great job around educating around media literacy. And Ross and I have attended their boot camps locally, where they brought in journalists and media experts. So fantastic program. I think there are a lot of educators in the area that are using it. And I encourage you, now that it's a free product, to take a look.
I would as well. I think that, we didn't talk a whole lot about the compounding crises right now in our digital lives. So much of what's happening around the pandemic and our infodemic is, I think, demanding or asking more of us now and learning how to sift through what we see. There has then even been, as an example we gave tonight, disinformation around the protests and the BLM protests, and surely there will be problems related to the election. We're already seeing examples where mail-in ballot process and other electoral engagement has been at least attempted to be discredited. And so in the middle of all of that, I'm excited that Checkology is free, because I think it's important for all of us to try to introduce ourselves to these topics. I'm just giving it one other second in case. It looks like we don't have any other questions, but I do want to highlight yet again, I'm going to turn it to Robin to close us out, but we hope that you'll come next week. We have put in the chat another event, totally different, that we're hosting at PEN America tomorrow with Spanish language media, and really intended to help educate and talk with journalists about how Latinx voters receive information about the election and credible, nonpartisan news and election information. So we put that in the chat. Robin, can I turn to you to close us out?
Yeah, thank you. Nora, such a privilege to have you with us. really appreciate your partnership, and we're looking forward to being with you again next week. You all should have the registration by virtue of the fact that you registered today. You have the registration for next week, same time on Tuesday, the 18th at 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Check out denverlibrary.org/events for other online events on our calendar. And we thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.